Hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in. It's great to have so many of you joining us from all around the world. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands we're broadcasting from tonight. We pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. Welcome to UQ Talks, a flagship research engagement series designed to ignite your curiosity by giving you access to some of the brightest minds at your university. I'm Tegan Taylor, I'm a journalist with the ABC's Radio National, and I'm your host and moderator for this series. Tonight, I am joined by leading UQ researchers who are here to help answer your burning question, can we travel sustainably, when we know the impact of aviation emissions and over-tourism? So what does green travel look like in practice, and what advancements can we expect to see in the future? Before I introduce our speakers, a reminder that you can be part of the discussion tonight by asking your questions by using the Q&A button as we go. Some of you have pre-submitted questions ahead of time. They're brilliant. I dare you to outdo yourselves with some live questions during the broadcast. Depending on when you registered for this event, you may have seen Dr. Tony Haynen on the lineup. Unfortunately, Tony is unable to join us tonight, but joining me in the studio are two esteemed UQ academics. Professor Esteban Marcelin is Director of the Biosustainability Hub at the Australian Institute for Bioengineering and Nanotechnology at UQ. Have you considered a less of a mouthful?
I'll pass on your message.
Esteban leads the Marcelin Group, which is dedicated to better understanding biological cells to enhance the production of fuels, chemicals and biopharmaceuticals. And I'm also joined by Professor Dolnikar, an Australian Research Council Laureate Fellow at the School of Business at UQ's Faculty of Business, Economics and Law. Sarah's current research is focused on developing and testing interventions that trigger pro-environmental behaviour in tourists. So I'm really excited to get into this. And I want to start because it's kind of a question we don't really want to think about when we're looking forward to going on a trip. But Sarah, can you give us a sense of what the environmental footprint of tourism is?
Yeah, I mean, the tourism industry sounds very romantic, right? Because we all like to travel and get away and lie on the beach, but actually it is quite unsustainable. It's the fifth most polluting industry of all industries, and we wouldn't think of tourism as being a polluting industry. 8% of all carbon emissions, between 8 and 10% of all carbon emissions are caused by the tourism industry. 35 million tons of waste. I could go on. 300 liters of fresh water for every tourist staying in a hotel every day. That's not because they shower excessively, but by the time you add landscaping, pool refilling, laundry, all of these things, a huge amount of water is used. So overall, it's not a very sustainable industry in terms of the environment. But again, there are benefits, right? There are huge economic and social benefits. So 1 in every 10 jobs comes from tourism. That's 10% of all global GDP comes. Those are undeniable benefits to local communities. But on the environmental side, it is not, it's not your model industry.
And then you've actually got to get there, which for most of us, especially for in Australia, involves aviation. Esteban, what do we sort of know about the aviation industry in its role as a source of carbon emissions?
Yeah, so sadly, the aviation industry is an industry that is very difficult to decarbonize. So to fly from, let's say, Brisbane to London, of course, there are many miles, and there are parts of transportation fields that can be decarbonized relatively easy. So we can, you mentioned the other day that you drove to UQ on your electric car.
Yes, I did.
It's hard to imagine you will fly to London on your electric plane in the near future. The reason for that is because these batteries are very heavy, and the size of it will mean the plane will need to look dramatically different. Importantly, the aviation sector is also very risk adverse, so they're not willing to make changes because it's been so safe and well accepted that it's very difficult to change dramatically. However, I think you will be able to fly from Brisbane to Sydney in an electric plane, hopefully, in the next 30 years. But I don't think you'll be able to do that from Brisbane to Europe or longer haul flights. So we do need sustainable aviation fuel. So there are lots of things that we're trying for that. The sustainability of those fuels is still debatable, but it is something that we're looking at a life cycle analysis and trying to make sure they are as sustainable as we can.
I'm really interested to dig in on the sustainable aviation fuels because I didn't even know that that was something that was on the horizon until we started talking about this. But I did want to touch on the urgency, the timescale that we need to be looking at, because climate change is an immediate growing threat. And is it a problem we can tree plant our way out of? We sort of need more immediate action. Sarah?
Well, I mean, my position is we could have tree planted decades ago out of the problem. Now it's a bit late for tree planting, right? Like now, if you look at all the data, the heat patterns we see are exponential. I mean, they are just going real fast. So I think urgent action is needed real quick. So there's no time for carbon offsetting, planting trees and hoping that they will solve the problem. That would be my view of the world.
And we've got the 2032 Olympics coming up here in Brisbane.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, and this blows my mind, but not too many people know that February 2024 is the time where officially, according to the Copernicus Institute in Europe, that we've gone past the 1.5 degrees, which was the commitment from the Paris Agreement. So in the last, and this was 2015, we've done pretty much nothing about it. So we've lost the time, and we have levels of CO2 in our atmosphere that are alarming for the health of the planet.
I can see you nodding there, Sarah. Do you want to add to that?
Well, I'm also fascinated how there is no greater sense of urgency. You know,
Same.
how everyday people like us, politicians, everyone's walking around as if there's no problem. And that's really quite mind-boggling, because everyone from politicians to the everyday person can contribute, but somehow we don't think we need to, right? And that's really catastrophic.
I feel like, and you would know this better than me, you're working in this space every day, the conversations do seem to be more feverish than they used to be, but the action I'm not so sure about. So I do want to talk about solutions tonight. And when people sent in their questions ahead of time, we had a lot of questions asking about carbon offsets. The kind of questions around like, are they a scam? Do they work? Are they enough? Do the money that you pay, if you're adding a couple of dollars onto your, or whatever the product is that you're buying, maybe an airfare, maybe I was offered a carbon offset for my parking the other day, does that money actually go where you hope it goes to? What do we know about this?
I don't know enough. I must be honest, it's not something I know a lot about, but I do know many of them are probably not as effective as we would hope, and some of them are actually a bit dubious. I think if you want to travel sustainably, probably you can do a lot on your own, and I think Sarah knows a lot about it, but I think some of those things are probably more efficient. Not saying you shouldn't, but in my opinion, and I always pay it because it makes me feel better, but I know it's just that.
That's what I wanted to pick up on with Sarah, because you're all about attitudes and behavior change.
Yeah, so I think that's the problem. I mean, it's not a scam. I mean, I don't know everyone, right? But the major airlines, they do this honestly. They will take that money, they will invest it into projects that have environmental benefits. But to believe that what are you what are you paying for? You pay the offset, and then you're all happy because you can fly now, because you paid your way out of the guilt, and that's really not, that then ends up being counterproductive. So because it is now at such a catastrophic level, I think really the carbon offsets are not gonna fix it. People need to rethink, and governments need to rethink how we can make much more radical, quicker changes. But they're not scams. I mean, I think it's also a good excuse to not pay, right? Oh, I'm not paying because it's probably just a scam, right? So, all these games are not helpful. The truth is there are much more tangible things you can do than negotiate with yourself whether you're going to pay $2.50 on top of a $300 fare.
So I did want to ask about that, because what do we know about, if you've done something that feels good, does that create a virtuous circle where you keep doing things that are good? Or do you go, well, I've done my good deed, so now I'm going to do something, I'm going to treat myself to something else or not worry about it anymore?
Well, I think both phenomena exist, right? It depends what person you are and in which context, yeah? But I think, we're very good at what we call dealing with cognitive dissonance. So cognitive dissonance is if I hold a certain belief, like I like the environment, I want to protect the environment. And then I go and I fly, a cheap around the world ticket. Yeah. So there's a tension. That tension is called cognitive dissonance. We can't reconcile the way we feel and think with the way we behave. And so people are masters of overcoming cognitive dissonance, right? So one of my PhD students about 10 years ago interviewed volunteers for the environment, like Greenpeace and organizations like that. So we interviewed these people specifically because we knew that their belief system and their value system was like super environmental. They were donating their time, right, for the environment. And then we started chatting about their travel. And they all knew that the travel is environmentally not sustainable. But they came up with the most marvelous justifications why it's okay. Yeah? Everything from I have to travel because my auntie is sick, to, well, yeah, tourism is bad, but mining's much worse, to, yeah, tourism is bad, but other tourists are worse than me. The list goes on forever. So we humans are masters at justifying the behavior we actually want to display. And if we keep doing it, there's no way back, right? Like at some point, we just need to say, this is not working. And if we go on like that, we're going to be in big trouble.
So staying with the idea of carbon offsets for a while, because another related question that we were getting a lot from people who were submitting ahead of time was around whether certain aircraft are more sustainable than others. Do we have any data on that, or is it a meaningful difference?
I would love to answer that. I don't know.
Yeah.
I think I do know. There are aircraft that use more fuel than others per passenger, for sure. I don't know the models. I know new aircrafts are way better, and there are changes that are happening. I mean, lots of new materials, making the materials much lighter. All of those things contribute, no doubt about that. Engines more efficient, all of that. But you never know which aircraft you're going to end up flying.
Choose.
And you can't choose, so yeah, it is what it is.
But Esteban, can I ask you? You said I can fly to Melbourne on an electric.
Not tomorrow,
now, but I will at some point.
I think so.
So, do you think it's better for me to hop on that kind of plane or on a train?
Well, it depends, right?
There is no train. But
yeah, exactly.
If there were a train, what's the comparative environmental impact of an electric plane versus a train?
It's a very difficult question because to do a proper assessment, you really need to look at lots of things. Like there's, for example, rare earth metals that go into batteries. How long would that battery be acceptable to the aviation industry? Because we know cars, they have a lifespan depending on the car. Some of the best ones will have a warranty of 20 years for the batteries. Others, more conventional ones, will be 7 to 8 years. That doesn't mean your battery will die after that time, but it is likely that the aviation fuel will have different restrictions and acceptance of what is acceptable for a battery, because you don't want your airplane to run out of battery.
You really don't.
So there will be all those things to be considered, and at this particular time, because there's no such a flight, that life cycle analysis cannot happen. Yeah. So it's difficult for me to answer that question.
But wouldn't you say that the train doesn't have a battery? So by definition, the train will be better than the plane?
Well, a lot of it, in Australia at least, it depends where the electricity comes. So if you have a car that you charge at home with your solar panel, it's very different to having your car charged from coal, right? So, and sometimes you don't know, but all those things need to be taken into account to really understand what you're doing in terms of how you fly. Yeah.
So if we're comparing types of transport, another question that people were asking were about cruises and whether, you could sail like Greta Thunberg if you could, but there's also, you can catch a boat somewhere. What do we know about the carbon footprint of cruise ships?
Yeah, that's a good question. There was a paper recently, and I didn't read it carefully enough to give you the exact data, but they're not glamorous, I can tell you that much. So they're not environmentally sustainable. They obviously use a lot of fuel to cruise around. But there's also things we can learn from them, right? Like they do some things extremely well because they're this closed system. So they need to deal with their sewage. They need to basically recycle the water before they discharge it. They have a brilliant system for reducing food waste, which surprisingly has not been adopted widely elsewhere. What they do, so at buffets, right, you know, the classic cruise ship buffet, so what they do instead of letting people serve themselves is they will have staff, no, not all of them, but selected cruise lines, will have staff give you a specific portion of food. So you can't overfill your plate, and you can go back as often as you want and get another portion, but they will actually refuse increasing the portion, right? Because we know that people, the eyes are bigger than the hunger is, and so they overfill the plate and a lot goes to waste. Of course, food generally is I mean, if we think of all the things, it's not just flying. Food is 26% of all carbon emissions is kind of food related. So, you know, tourism has a lot to do with food, with the production, consumption, but also waste of food, water use. You know, there's a lot of other things that, you know, we could still do as individuals and governments to reduce the footprint of tourism.
Well, let's talk about that. So we sort of talked a little bit about getting there in your plane or whatever. It's all pretty much bad news as far as I can tell, but we'll talk about sustainable aviation fuels in a tick. But once you get to your destination, there were questions about the pros and cons of tourism. So obviously any sort of activity that you do wherever you are is going to have some kind of cost, but then there's also benefits potentially to those nations and then perhaps also to those environments depending on what kind of tourism it is. What do we know, Sarah?
Yeah, so of course there's big differences in impact. Maybe just to backtrack, I think the transport is not a lost case, right? Because actually, from a tourism perspective, COVID was interesting. Yep. Suddenly we were locked in our state. And did we not have holidays? Well, we did have holidays. But suddenly it was much closer. And we potentially went by train. And was it a worse holiday? Well, not always, right? So actually there's a whole concept of a holiday that does not mean that we need to hop on a flight and get out of the country, yeah? So I think there's still a lot of improvement in the transport space that we could achieve. And now I forgot your question. When we get to the destination.
When you get there.
Yes.
So talk to me about hotels.
Yeah, so it's hotels, it's transport at the destination. Hotels, for example. So simple things we can do, and when I say we, it's me as a tourist, it's me as a hotel manager, and it's me as a government. Let's think of routine daily room cleaning. Who invented that? Like, why do we clean a room daily, right? So in a 4-star hotel, that's one where we did some research. We actually measured what it means. It means 1.5 kilowatt hours of electricity every time we clean a room for vacuum cleaning and stuff, 100 milliliters of chemicals to wash the bathroom, 35 liters of water, all for one room clean. Yeah, totally wasted if you do not need. Sometimes you might need it, but most of the time you don't, right? And yet the routine process in hotels is we will clean your room unless you tell us not to. Yeah? So what can we do here? The hotel can change the default. In fact, we've done a study of that nature where we just told the tourist, instead of telling me when you don't want it cleaned, how about you tell me when you do want it cleaned? And we reduced room cleaning by 63%. With absolutely no impact on guest satisfaction. So the hotel can change how it operates without actually undermining the happiness of their tourists. The tourist can choose, well, I don't need the daily room clean, that's just ridiculous, and waive it. So there's already 2 stakeholders who can have a massive impact. And the governments could really take action. I've never understood why the government doesn't say, in my country, in my state, it is prohibited for hotels to clean the room every day. Every hotel is free to clean upon request. We're not limiting your service level, but the fact that you are going to routinely clean the room is just not on, right? Now, I know that's radical. No government likes to tell their businesses what to do. But just to illustrate, just with room cleaning, how really at multiple levels we could have pretty quick changes that would have material impact almost immediately, right, compared to planting a tree.
What about the towel thing? Because every hotel you go to, there's a little plaque that says,
Yes,
oh, we care
that's
about
right.
the environment. You do you as well. Hang your towel up.
So what do you do with your plaque? What do you do with your sign?
I mean, I hang my towel up anyway. I'm not a monster. Like, has that made a difference?
No.
Okay.
No, very simple answer. We've tried it multiple times because we never believed it works. So we've done a number of experiments where we had alternative approaches, and we always tested the conventional approach that we see. And it basically has absolutely no effect whatsoever. Right?
Why?
Why? Yeah, well, because here's why. Actually, today, a student reported on a survey that they just ran, which is fascinating. They compared our self-identity when we're at home with the self-identity, how we see ourselves when we're on vacation. And turns out we see ourselves quite differently, right? When I'm at home, I'm responsible, financially responsible, socially responsible, I behave myself, all these things, I'm sustainable. Well, then I come to the destination. I'm relaxed, I'm disorganized, I don't care about the environment, I'm irresponsible, I let myself go, right? So I go in the hotel, I want to enjoy myself, that's why I'm here, right? I'm not here to be responsible. So most people shove the sign aside and do whatever they want, right? That's just the reality of it. So of course there's always a small proportion of people who will do it, but in all likelihood they would do it anyway. So I think that if you want to just communicate, reuse your towel, there's probably smarter ways of doing it than this whole spiel. It's actually particular these belief-based interventions that don't work. So when people are in this enjoyment space, they're not particularly excited to switch on their brain and start analyzing. So there's facts about water and disuse and chemicals. Well, I'm not going to analyze it because I just want to go on the balcony, have a nice drink, and look at the ocean, right? And that's why these things fail. It's a very specific context. It's a hedonic context. It's all about my enjoyment, right? Business travel is different. Business travel we don't even talk about because those are the people who actually view the hotel as an extension of their home, right? They will eat the same thing for breakfast, they will reuse their towel, they will behave like at home. But if we're talking leisure tourism, that's my special time. This is my 2 weeks of enjoyment in a whole working year. I'm just gonna let myself go. And I give myself, the technical term is license to sin. Yeah? Now I can. Those 2 weeks, they don't count. Yeah?
I do want to come back to that in more detail, but I can't help myself. We've got to talk about sustainable aviation fuels because it's a space that I don't think we've heard enough about. Talk to me about what's on the table in terms of sustainable fuels.
Sure. So there's multiple avenues and multiple strategies that are in place in order to try to make these fuels sustainable. My passion, or the bit that I'm more passionate about, is trying to use greenhouse gases to make those fuels. So, for example, we have big sources of CO2 and carbon monoxide, or a mixture of carbon monoxide, CO2 and hydrogen, and I'm getting a bit technical, but there's bacteria that can turn those into products. So we work with a company called Lanzatech that converts those greenhouse gases into alcohols. So those are just ethanol, like the ethanol you'll find in your vodka, but we know those alcohols are good fuels. For example, you can put up to 10% in a normal car. Obviously, you can't fly planes on ethanol, but we can polymerize those ethanol molecules and make them longer using chemistry, so we can make sustainable aviation fuel from greenhouse gases. So you give the carbon one more chance. So
you're still burning it.
Yes.
And it's still then going out as an emission, but it's recycling something that's already around.
So it's, for example, carbon that was going to be emitted anyway. So we're working with steel mills, for example. They normally turn those greenhouse gases, they are vented. So they go into the atmosphere. Instead of doing that, we will reuse it one more time. So what it really does is it keeps oil underground. So it gives, you don't need that oil because it can stay there one more time. Sure, it'll be emitted, it'll be turned into CO2 eventually, but it gives that carbon at least one go before it gets eventually released.
So that's reusing a carbon, a greenhouse gas that already exists. What about biofuels?
Yeah, so biofuels are obviously very exciting. There are different types of biofuels, and it all comes to what the feedstock used to make those biofuels is. And there are different crops that have different environmental impact. And because, to be honest, it's not just about greenhouse gases. I mean, it's really about looking at the issue as the planetary boundaries of our planet. So there are problems with biodiversity, land clearing. There are lots of things happening to our planet that we need to take into account. And it's specific to the place. For example, if we use sugarcane to make those biofuels, it depends where that sugarcane comes from. But of course, we know that in some parts of the world, that sugarcane can utilize a lot of nitrogen. That nitrogen can end up in the ocean, and sometimes there's amazing ecosystems like the Great Barrier Reef that will have problems with too much nitrogen coming and being degraded. So it really depends. In other places of the world, I mean, each particular crop will have its own problems, but it is very specific to that. So it's really about making an assessment of where that carbon comes from. And in my particular opinion, food should be used to be eaten, not to make fuels. We can find ways to make those fuels with waste resources. So for example, we can use agricultural waste or food waste or all type of different waste to make those fuels, and that is a lot more sustainable.
Are we always going to be burning stuff to be able to fly?
Look, I obviously don't know, right? I have no idea. I would say for the next 30 years, it's very likely that we will. And those things, I mean, I guess you're asking, are we always going to burn fuels that will be emitting CO2? I think at least in the next 30 years, it's likely that we will. There are technology that is being trialed where those fuels will be very environmentally friendly. For example, there are trials for hydrogen planes, so which of course there's no carbon being emitted, but of course they have their own problems, and that might actually happen, but I think it is probably a little bit longer, because of safety reasons and many things that come with using hydrogen, which is a very difficult fuel to transport. It's very explosive. It has some issues on its own. So I think, unfortunately, for the next 30 years, I think we will be using liquid fuels to fly long-haul flights.
I do want to come back to behaviour change, because I think a lot of the questions that we've got have been very much about what can I do as an individual, but what we're hearing from Esteban is that a whole industry needs to change. Sarah, what do we know about getting industries to look to the future and act?
Well, I mean, look to the future. It's very difficult, isn't it? If you think about the tourism industry, the future is growth, growth, growth. We've already reached in Europe back to pre-COVID levels, and growth is just predicted to increase. Carbon emissions are predicted to increase, dramatically from the tourism sector. So they are looking into the future, but they're not necessarily looking into a future that's exactly right. Yeah? And actually that brings me back, now I remembered the question I didn't answer before about locality. And it reminded me when you said the sugar cane, it depends where things come from, and over-tourism. So, one thing you can choose is where to go. If you're gonna go to New York or Barcelona or Paris, well, that's probably not super beneficial to their economy. But if you go to, where is it, Birdsville? Is it Birdsville where they have the big festival? Well, that actually really has community benefits, right? And that's almost the same conversation we had about Airbnb for many years. So, if we can expand tourism in rural and remote and regional areas where people would like to live but have no source of income, well, the benefit of your tourist activity is substantially higher than going to a place that's already so overcrowded that it's causing not only environmental but social tensions that you are going there. So there's a lot of decision for the individual tourist. Where do I go? How do I travel there? When I am there, what accommodation do I choose? How do I travel around the destination? What activities do I engage in? All these things, every one of them has an environmental consequence.
What about ecotourism, where you're going to a place, a natural wonder, like the Great Barrier Reef or like a remote island in the Pacific, where you're going there for something unspoiled and natural, but the volume of tourists that are going there is having an impact as well.
Well, I think the term ecotourism is extremely badly defined. We once looked at it, and pretty much everyone who writes about ecotourism has their own worldview of what it means, right? So sometimes it just means nature tourism. That's not necessarily a good thing. Sometimes it means environmentally sustainable. So yeah, but going into remote, pristine areas is clearly not always a good thing. Yeah. So or for example, going to a pristine area and walking off the track. Yeah, we have a lot of delinquent behavior like that. Or going on a tour to the Arctic and the Antarctic, right? Once in a lifetime experience. But really, you know, sustainability, from a sustainability point of view, an absolute disaster. So yeah,
is it?
I would say yeah, it is.
Why?
Yeah.
Why?
Oh well,
Esteban's dreams are being crushed over here.
you want to go? Do you?
my wife was talking about going there, so
Yeah.
and she's way more conscious than
Yeah.
me. So.
Well, I was quite amused because we did this little research project. Well, we listened to someone today in our group seminar actually, and they were telling us about how there is a Arctic ambassador pledge where you can kind of say, I will behave really well. And so you're basically going on this ship, presumably, and you're going through all these pristine areas. And then as
Breaking
an
the
ambassador,
ice.
yes, and then as an ambassador, you're committing to not getting too close to wildlife. You know, and like really kind of minimal things. And I thought that's remarkable because again, if you add up all the, you know, all the sustainability problems you've caused with this trip per capita against I didn't go too close to the animal. It's really like planting a tree today to hope that climate change changes tomorrow. Yeah.
So if you have a question, that's actually a question that someone asked us about going to Antarctica. If you've got a question, smash the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. I'm going to get to lots of your questions in just a tick. So I do feel like we're talking about short-term actions that we can take. And I want to talk a bit more about that before we talk about long-term stuff, because I think that we have a lot of conversations about long-term, big picture policy action. That's the stuff that's going to shift the needle, but we can feel very far away from it as individuals. What are a few small practical things that individuals can do, Sarah?
Well, first of all, you decide where do you want to go. Secondly, you decide how do you want to go, right? I mean, if you can go by train, I know in Australia this is not such a, but I mean, in Europe there's now flight shaming. Like my colleagues are embarrassed to say that they're flying within Europe because it's expected that you're going to go by train. So it's very interesting behavior change things happening, right? Where there's peer pressure against a certain transport mode. So where do you go? How do you go there? Again, what accommodation do you choose? Are you going to go for a luxury hotel that has like hectares and hectares of landscaped gardens? All of that requires water. You know, it's all about the resource intensity. And it's of course most hypocritical if you go to a country that's facing significant water shortages and you go into a luxury hotel where, you know, there's fountains and lush gardens. How do you behave in the hotel? You can opt out of room cleaning. You go to a buffet, you do not take, I mean, studying buffets is probably one of the most fascinating things. Just sit at a buffet and observe people. It's just the most fascinating thing. It's almost like they're worried that there will be no more food tomorrow. Yes, and they just go to the buffet and they fill up the plate. And then, you know, usually a third of what's there on average is left over. Of course, you can't send it to Oxfam. You can't, you know, like you can't do anything with that. You might be able to compost it, but you can't reuse it directly. So that then goes and generates methane in landfill. So this so many little things. And, you know, whenever I have this conversation or I give talks about our research, people say, yes, but Sarah, they're all little things. Well, they are all little things. But if every tourist every day would do all these little things, it would be a material impact on the environment. Of course, they're not the big ticket items. You know, if you would ask me, Sarah, what's the radical change? Well, I think all governments need to commit to certain things, you know, to actually say we're not doing this, top down, because otherwise the speed is not going to happen, right? But if you ask me what can you do, you can do a lot, yeah? Refuse a water bottle. You're in a hotel, you get 2 plastic bottles in a country where the tap water is safe to drink. Why are you opening that bottle? Yeah? So it's really plenty of things we can do on an everyday basis that can have a material impact, and we should be doing it by default. And in many instances, business benefit because they save money. Yeah? If I'm in an area where the tap water is safe, why wouldn't I save the money for the plastic bottles and just tell my people to use the glass and get the water from the tap? So there's ample opportunity to behave sustainably, but again, and it will make a difference, but will it make the difference fast enough where we are right now at this point in history? That, of course, is the big question.
Esteban, small changes?
Look, I'm actually guilty of many of the things that Sarah has said. I'm not going to lie.
And I'm flying, I'm not going to lie.
But look, even on my everyday life, many times I think, is this making a difference? And because I know the data and I know how hot this planet is, and I actually come to the conclusion that it's probably not, so I'm just going to drink that water. But it's wrong, and I totally know that it's wrong, because if we all don't drink that bottle of water, it will eventually make a difference. I totally agree. So I think it's really about understanding that those individual changes do make a huge difference when everyone, I mean, soon will be 10 billion people in this planet. So that's potentially 10 billion plastic bottles. So that's a huge number of plastic bottles. And like that, I mean, there's so many examples that can make a huge difference.
Or one-way cups. That's another little pet hate. The single-use cups, where people go to a cafe and they take a single-use cup and then sit down at the table in the cafe and consume their coffee at the restaurant in a single-use cup.
This just feels like your list of personal gripes now.
No, but it's true. I mean, this is a real
But
problem
sometimes
because they don't decompose, right?
But
they don't
sometimes you
decompose.
have to. Sometimes they don't.
Of course,
offer.
sometimes that's fine. I will not argue with that.
Yeah,
But you know, like instances where you have a conference setting, and where you are in the same hotel for every single session and every single meal, and you are offered a choice between a porcelain cup and a single use. Why are you offered that choice? Yeah, because it's a closed system. Even if you take that cup to your room, it's not gonna unless you steal it. Okay, you steal it, right? But that's very unlikely because they're not so attractive usually. So there are a lot of things that we do not think about. Yeah, we just don't. We go to a cafe, you know, and we just say, oh yeah, I'll just take the single-use cup. Why? I mean, does it really increase your enjoyment? Does it justify, you know, that footprint you're creating?
And so finally, I did want to talk about things that aren't carbon, because the focus has very much been about carbon, and a warming planet is going to have all sorts of different environmental knock-on effects as well as being unpleasant to live in. But we are also talking about waste, we're also talking about local ecosystem impacts and consuming resources. How do we ensure that that doesn't get lost in this debate?
Well, I mean, for like in our work, it's not at all carbon emissions focused. I mean, of course, everyone likes to talk. It's become the unified currency, right? When we talk about sustainability,
because you can measure it and because you can offset it.
Yeah. Well, you
can do accounting around it.
Yeah, you can do accounting, but yeah, I mean, it's good. I mean, it's better than nothing. I'm not criticizing. It's better to have a currency than no currency to talk about environment. But of course, it is land use. Of course, it is. It is. Chopping down trees to make more farms to feed tourists. Like these are big cycles. It's not just the little things, it's the whole systematic thing. But water use is a big one, right? I mean, you can also kind of calculate emissions out of water use, but water use is a big one. And it's very direct. Like tourism happens often in countries. Increasingly many countries have problems with water. I think it was just in Spain recently where they basically shut down the water for hotels because they just don't have any water. I forgot what the destination was. In the last few weeks it happened. So increasingly, because the weather is changing, many destinations will have no water. So saving water becomes kind of a real priority, both environmentally and socially, because you're basically competing for limited water with a local community. You know, so that's direct resource use challenges.
And you're looking at some long range.
Yeah, so I mean, in my world, it is all about trying to recycle carbon and reuse carbon. So of course, we talk a lot about carbon emissions, but it's by far not the only issue that our planet is facing. I mean, when you look at like how many species we're losing, I mean, water, like so many things. And at the same time, I think it's unfair from us in our privileged life to be judgmental with other countries that haven't had the same time to develop or be where we are. So of course it's comfortable for us to say, okay, I'm going to reduce my emissions, but can we ask countries that haven't had the same chance or the timing hasn't been the same to behave the way we are? I don't think we can. And we need to be understanding that, for example, I mean, many people complain about emissions coming from the highly populated countries, where other countries have had the opportunity to develop, destroy the environment like there's no tomorrow, and now they're sitting and judging those. I think that is really unfair, and we need to take all those things into account, because we just can't judge like others for the ways we have behaved in the past and got us where we are now, which is really, really unfair for the less advantaged places in the world.
Did you have something to add, Sarah?
No, I was just thinking about, because now everyone feels guilty. And actually, I think that the way out is not guilt, but it's enjoyment, right? Like a lot of the experiments we did, the best results we achieve are when we tie the behavior we want to see to actually fun or a reward, right? Because that's how humans operate. So guilt is actually really bad. To tell people you're a bad person because you're drinking this water bottle is actually not very powerful. But to entice them by offering some kind of added benefit from the right behavior, that works really well. So if we think back about the food waste, we had a little stamp collection game, really simple. Everyone who's got kids knows stamps and stickers, right? You get everything for stamps and stickers. So we just had a simple A4 piece of paper. When people checked in at the reception, they were invited to play a stamp collection game. And it was a very simple game. Every day at the dinner buffet, if you ate up everything you took, you could take as much as you want, you could stay as long as you wanted. But when you left to go back to your room, if the plates were empty, you got a stamp. And if you got a stamp for every evening that you ate up, you got a little reward at the checkout. And you can only imagine, the kids went wild. Yeah? The parents were happy because it was in line with their education. So it was a win-win for everyone. The hotel saved huge amounts of money because of the waste saved and the ordering saved. So what happened here is we didn't even mention the environment, right? We just say, we've got a game for you. And those are the rules of the game. And suddenly the behavior happens. So in fact, I'm a big proponent to change behavior in a enjoyable way. It is, for everything we've done so far, it appears to be far more powerful than this providing of information, assuming people think about it, guilt-tripping people, social pressuring people. And we could do that in many instances with just a little bit of, creativity of how you could make something enjoyable to people.
So thinking about initiatives like that, you mentioned before legislation. Can we take a long-range, big-picture view? What changes should we have enacted in the next 20 to 30 years? Esteban?
Well, I guess there is, when we talk about where we are now in terms of our climate, not everything is lost. In fact, there is an extreme opportunity to really solve what can be a huge problem in the future. So if we reduce our emissions today for the next, I think it's until 2034, it will make a massive difference to the climate. So there is an urgency to act, and if we do that, I think there is a bright future for our planet, because it will teach us how to live sustainable. So I think there is an incredible window of opportunity in the next 10 to 15 years, actually more 10, because we were a bit like we weren't too good in the past, in the last 10, but we have 10 years to really do something. I really think we need some sort of incentives or sticks from the government, making sure we say, well, this is not okay, this is not acceptable. To just behave the way we have behaved for the past 10 years is actually be a huge problem. And the problem, and personally I think, the problem is the politicians only have 5 years to be in government. So this is a 10-year problem. And they know this is not going to be a nice place in 10 years, but it's okay because they will be retired or doing something else by then, which is really the huge problem. But there should be a cost of emitting. There should be, we should be paying for the real cost of burning fossil fuels that are extracted from underground. So it took millions of years for that oil to be formed and stay where it is. We've spent 100 years in digging it all up at once. So it is a very difficult challenge, but there is an incredible opportunity to, and it's a very difficult thing, but we as humans can solve it. I mean, we during the pandemic, we solved an incredibly difficult thing in record time. So if we could put the same energy we put for the pandemic to climate now, I'm sure we will come up with solutions that are absolutely fine and will get us to where we want to be. But the issue is people don't really see it. Like, it's not, I'm going to be sick tomorrow if it's the problem, right? It's the immediate time that is difficult for people to process, and people just don't see it.
We're going to go to your questions in just a tick, but Sarah, your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think I agree. It's either the stick or the carrot, right? Mm-hmm. So if you're the government, you can either say these are the unacceptable ways to run business, and we prohibit it. We prohibit plastic bottles, we prohibit little shampoo bottles. And by the way, it's not a radical demand. Like California, Shanghai, they all prohibited the little shampoo bottles. The world doesn't stop turning and the tourists don't stop coming. So it's either the government saying these processes are just unacceptable because they're too costly in terms of our environment, we're not doing it. Or to incentivize, so to say to hotels, here are the benefits you get from the government for behaving in the right way. You know, we will promote you more, we will, it could be all sorts of things, right? It's one or the other if you're the government. But right now there's neither of the two is happening really. Yeah.
So lots of questions coming through via the Q&A button at the bottom of your chat, which if you hit now, you can add your question to the list. A couple of people asking questions that are trying to compare different types of travel. So one person's asking, is, say, backpacking more sustainable than staying in a resort versus traveling in developing regions? Another person's asking, is a 24-hour train trip more sustainable than a 2-hour flight? How do we balance these equations?
Sarah.
Oh, thanks. Well, I think it's not easy to balance. Actually, there are a whole bunch of carbon calculators now. You can actually hop online and put your itinerary in and get a rough estimate of your, of your carbon emissions. But I don't think that the 12 hours matters so much. Like, I think if the resource intensity of the train, you're the transport expert, I shouldn't be talking about that, but then it doesn't matter how long you travel, right? Because it's about the output that's negative to the environment. So I think here the answer is relatively straightforward. What was the other aspect?
Backpacking versus staying in a resort.
Oh, that's clear. It's clearly backpacking because you need to think about the resort, right? So if you're in a backpackers, land use is minimal, the things are tiny, you're using a very small amount of space, there's no landscaping, there's no swimming pool, there's no luxuries. The resort is hugely environmentally unsustainable. So that's a clear answer. Do we have any more scenarios?
No, I was going to move on. Well, what is your opinion on the future of international conferences?
It's an interesting one.
It's an interesting one, and to be fair, I very recently just organized a conference where people were working on this idea of using greenhouse gases to make fuels, chemicals, so they are all very sustainably oriented in their research. Many of our colleagues say, well, I'm not going to Australia for a conference because the flight is too long. And I fully respect that. I personally, during COVID, I attended many online conferences, which actually didn't do the same thing as the networking, the collaborations that come from a conference are huge. As a scientist, we need those. And I know I'm saying the things that You ask the Greenpeace people. But it's true. We actually do need to collaborate. And in science, it's very difficult to just think you're amazing on your own and you're going to solve things on your own. It's just not possible, and we never do that. So these international conferences are really, really important for exchanging ideas, knowing people, networking, which you cannot do online. I mean, we tried, and it was great at the time, but in hindsight, it's really a very different experience. And it's particularly important for the young people that are building a career. They need to know the people in the field. They need to form a network. So I think, personally, I think they're very beneficial.
Sarah?
Yeah, I'd have to agree. As much as I hate to agree with that, because obviously it would be nice to say Zoom can replace everything, but it's just not true. So my problem is the
We're talking to
creative
people
space.
who are joining us online tonight.
Yeah, no, but I mean, it's true. You know, you give keynotes on Zoom, or you give keynotes if you give keynotes to humans in a room, you will have 30 conversations afterwards, and 10 of them will lead to something. But it's not just conferences. Like I travel to Europe to work with my collaborators, right? And that's a problem. It's far to go to Europe. But I can tell you, the idea generation of being together in a room for 12 hours is a whole different quality than being on Zoom when one of us is exhausted because it's either early in the morning or late at night. So sadly, that's the case. So, you know, I can only say how I personally deal with it. Actually, not my personally. A colleague of mine will just come to Australia if it's for 2 months. So they basically say, if I'm going to have that, footprint, then I will make it worth it. I will not come for 1 week. The way I manage it is I say, look, these are the 3 things that I can combine. So there will always be a conference I want to go to in Europe. I always have project work to do with colleagues in Europe. I obviously have family in Europe. So the way I try to justify it, because I'm also just human, even though I study humans, is that you combine as much. If you're going to have that trip, make it count, right? Try to pack as much in for that amount of carbon emissions you're generating.
So a question here asking, if I choose to travel, how do I find effective offset providers and avoid greenwashing? And greenwashing was a theme that came up in the pre-submitted questions as well. Sarah?
Very difficult, very, very difficult, because everyone's greenwashing. Yeah, so it's very hard to say. There are a few, well-known certifiers of hotels or these kind of things, but how do you prevent individual greenwashing? It's practically impossible. Any hotel, any destination can pop some certificate on, so that's really, really very difficult. Offsetting, I already said, I think you can't. I mean, at this point in time, now we have a good timeline, 10 years, right? So in those 10 years, that tree is not gonna fix the problem. So I don't think you can offset your way out of it. I think greenwashing is a real problem. It will probably get worse because, believe it or not, currently the market of consumers who are interested in sustainable travel is very low. So if you ask people, again, another little study we did, we asked people, so we had 2 identical boat tours. And when people bought the ticket, we asked them, did you consider the environment when you chose which of the 2 identical boat tours you're going to take? 60% said, yes, I'm considering the environment. Then we jumped on the boat with them, and just so turns out that one of them was eco-certified and the other one wasn't. So once they were trapped on the boat, we said, is your boat eco-certified? What do you think was the percentage of people who knew? Very, very low, 14%. Okay, so that tells you the market share currently is at most 14. I would say 10% of people who would honestly consider that. But in the next 10 years, it will increase because people will feel more personally the impact of climate change. And as it increases, greenwashing activity will increase. So I think that's a really good question and not something I can give an easy answer to, because there will be misuse of, real or invented certifications.
Esteban?
Yeah, look, I mean, 2 things. First of all, no one wants to pay for sustainability. It's a hard thing, but when we ask people, we didn't, like people like you did, but there was they asked people, are you concerned about environmental, about 70% say yes, I am. About 7% were really adopting practices that were more sustainable, but only 2% were paying for sustainable products. And those 2% are the people that really can. They have enough money that it actually doesn't matter, and they just buy it because probably a feel-good sentiment. But it means we really need to make the exact same products, the same experience in a sustainable way. So that's a huge, huge, huge concern. And there is an enormous amount of greenwashing. The problem is so enormous that I think all those greenwashers, eventually they do a little bit good. I mean, they are going to plant some trees and they are going to do something. So, and we can't control it. So we just, I mean, when we organized this conference, we offset and, well, we bought some credits and felt good about the conference. But that's all you can do, right? I mean, what else can we do? But it is a very difficult thing. And there is a huge amount of greenwashing. I think eventually there will be less and less because it will be more regulated and more monitored and audited. And we need to get there. In the meantime, there will be a huge amount of greenwashing and not much you can do, I suspect.
Yeah, at an organisational level, there's this sense that we're kind of coming around to at the very beginning of our chat where we were talking about carbon offsets and whether there's a little bit of good in it because at least something's being done. You don't
No, I don't. I think it overcompensates with the buying yourself out of the guilt. I think generally, as you said, it makes us feel good. So we can now relax about all the harm we've done. So I'm a bit skeptical about those schemes. I think if you were to think hard about what can you do on your trip to make an impact, you would come up with 10 better ideas than offsetting, which I think would materially change the impact of your trip.
Well, we are nearly out of time, and I think we've baked into the discussion has been a lot of talk about the need for regulation, the need for legislation, and for big structural change, which of course is necessary and feels implicit. But for the people who've chosen to spend this last hour with us, wanting some practical tips, what's one thing that you hope that people take away from tonight to do differently? Sarah?
Well, I think you said it's about regulation. I think it's also about self-responsibility, right? That would be my one takeaway. I think we are in those 10 years where we can't say it's someone else's problem. So if it's my problem, what am I going to do today? And actually, if you think your life through that lens, I would suspect that many of us would make quite a few decisions differently. So I think instead of giving you a list of my 10 top gripes or 100,
the takeaway cups.
I think it's about, well, it is the takeaway cups. It's every little thing you do on a daily basis that when you think about it really doesn't improve the quality of your life, but does reduce your everyday environmental footprint.
Esteban?
And I think we as a society, we need to potentially start paying for sustainable solutions a little bit more. So for example, if there was a flight that uses sustainable fuel, it's going to cost more because we need to pay for the capex of building the plant to make sustainable aviation fuels, all those things that the oil and traditional industry, they don't need to worry about that. So is sustainable aviation fuel a little bit more expensive? Yes, it is. And does it mean you need to pay a little bit more for your flight? Absolutely. We need to be, when we can, and I'm saying not everyone can, but if you can, do select for those alternatives. They not only impact the carbon footprint that you take, but it creates a new industry. So that industry will cost money, will take time, and someone needs to pay for that. And the government is not necessarily wanting to do that, but we can as a society.
Well, we do have to leave it there for tonight. Thank you so much to Sarah and Esteban for sharing your expertise with us. And thank you for joining us. It's brilliant to have UQ alumni join us from around the world for these events virtually. Very, very small carbon footprint. We look forward to seeing you throughout the year for more UQ talks, both online and some in person as well. We have a lineup of topics that are sure to ignite your curiosity. So keep an eye on your inbox for those invitations. But for now, good night.